Okay, good evening to Sir Clemens and anyone who's watching this video. Thank you for this opportunity. Today, our group is going to present about Chapter 7 of the International Business book. It's about government policy and international trade. The actual title might differ from the previous version, but the subtopics explained in the chapter is pretty much the same. So we are Ella Sujana, Felis Salim, myself, Latifah Salsabila, and also Ivan Borismat. Next slide, please. So we are going to talk about the opening case, which is regarding to Boeing and Airbus. They are in a dogfight over illegal subsidies. So if you, as we probably have known already before, Boeing and Airbus are both main players in the airlines industry. We're not only talking about when it comes to the consumers in this aspect, but we're also talking about the production and how they are producing their airlines, their planes, and so on, because it involves many labor, many people, many capital, and so on. So they are the dominant players for large commercial jet aircraft of 100 seats or more. The two corporations are engaged in an ongoing war for market share, and for decades, these two corporations have accused each other of receiving government subsidies. So initially, in Airbus, for example, they received significant financial backing from European governments. So they are based in Europe. So their backings were UK, Spain, France, and Germany, in the form of low interest loans to develop new aircraft. So the method used here is low interest loan. We're going to talk about the different instruments later, but the one used here is the loan. So they're able to take on cheaper loans with lower interest rates to create new aircraft. And Boeing countered that the U.S., since they are based in the U.S., the U.S. grants subsidies and so on to NASA and the Department of Defense, and these indirectly subsidize their research and development because they're not just making commercial airplanes; they're also participated in making probably NASA rockets and so on and defense aircrafts. So so now that we've heard about what subsidy do for them, why is it a bad idea? Why is it such a bad thing that they are getting subsidies? It is because that subsidies are a big deal to distort the market. So when prices are out of the discussion, as long as it's cheap, people will go for the cheap ones. Then then it will shift the demand to more cheaper prices as opposed to better efficiency in fuel, better quality of uh, the materials used, better performance, and so on. And it can lead to job losses. So if Boeing gets more subsidies and people are shifting over to Boeing, then maybe in the long term, Airbus will have to lay off their employees and so on, and it can create tension between countries, especially if they're already at war with each other. So because again, this is not just about commercial aircrafts; they're also talking about the war and so on, the jets used in wars and so on. So it can create the market tension in between countries. Um, so this is why what this dispute, the World Trade Organization was called. So it's not just something simple between companies, but it is something that the World Trade Organization is involved in, and also the various governments that is involved. So Germany, France, and the US. So in to try to mitigate these issues, in 1992, both companies have aimed to phase out subsidies. However, as time goes on, for example, in 2004, the US claimed that Airbus is still getting illegal aid, and in 2010, 2016, WTO seems to also accuse the European Airbus for non-compliance to their rulings and so on. But then the EU also countersued and say that Boeing still gets illegal tax breaks from the US government because it helped because most of their um, uh, factories in the Washington state uh, is favored to them. We're also gonna see why these states, they also try to get as many factories in their state as many as possible. We're gonna hear about that later. Um, so yeah, the dispute is still ongoing to this day. Neither side is likely to impose sanctions due to the ongoing countersuits. So yeah, it can subsidies can create unfair advantages to people, to companies in a market. So yeah, the WTO seems to believe that both Airbus and Boeing have been the recipients of illegal subsidies. So what can we learn from this opening case? It's that although, as we've learned in previous meetings before in class, that free trade is used in many countries. Sometimes governments will still ended up participating in the trade and also make policies that make the trade results positive to the country and also to some players in the country. So we're gonna see more of that. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here are the instruments what the governments are using to control imports and exports to protect domestic industries and guide the balance of trade in their favor. So their favor might not necessarily means the better of their people, their country's people, but again, this is what they use. The first one is tariffs. So it is a tax levied on imports or exports. So specific tariffs are levied as a fixed charge for each unit of a good imported, for example, $3 per barrel of oil. And ad valorem tariffs are levied as a proportion of the value of the imported goods. So, for example, a ton of specific produce are gonna be added a tax of how many percentage, like that. The government gains from this because the tariff increases the government revenues, as we've learned in microeconomics and macroeconomics. Domestic producers also gain advantage from this because the tariff affords them some protection against foreign competitors. And the one that is really losing here is the consumers, the domestic consumers, because although maybe the imported products are more beneficial to them, maybe they were initially cheaper, maybe they were better in quality, more worth, more value in money, but because of these tariffs, they have to pay more per product. So the tariffs are generally pro-producer and anti-consumer, and import tariffs reduce the overall efficiency of world economy. Sometimes tariffs are levied on exports of a product from a country for reasons such as to raise export revenue for the government. Next slide, please. Next, we are going to talk about subsidy, which we already discussed in the opening case. So it is a government payment to a domestic producer. And it's not just a cash payment, it can be low interest loans, as we discussed in Airbus situation. It can be tax breaks, as it happened in the Boeing situation. So they don't have to pay taxes, or they can borrow money from the government or from banks with lower interest rates. So that's like financial help there is what makes them able to produce more. So lower production cost helps domestic producers compete against cheaper foreign imports. So the effectiveness, however, some subsidies may not actually improve competitiveness. As we've seen before, there are debates on this because people might just ended up going for the cheapest products as opposed to the quality of the product. And the cost versus benefits, the national economic gains may not outweigh the cost to taxpayers. So if a certain product is subsidized, then consumers that not use said products might be in a disadvantage because they don't really get the benefit from the subsidy. And if it's done in a long term and it's a huge amount, then it can be a disadvantage to many. So subsidies have the potential to be both beneficial and detrimental. While they are intended to benefit domestic companies, they may be costly and disrupt global markets. Their efficacy is dependent on how they are planned and implemented. Next slide, please. Um, okay, thank you. Now we're gonna talk about import quotas and voluntary export restraints. I'm gonna talk about the terms first because this is a quite unfamiliar topic sometimes. An import quota is a direct restriction on the quantity of some good that may be imported into a country, usually enforced by issuing import licenses to a group of individual firms. A tariff rate quota is a common hybrid of a quota and a tariff, and a lower tariff rate is applied to imports within a quota than those over the quota. And a voluntary export restraint, or a VER, is a quota on trade imposed by the exporting country, typically at the request of the importing country's government. A quota rent is the extra profit that producers make when supply is artificially limited to the by an import quota. So the graph here, I'm gonna roughly explain it. So it seems to suggest that there is a quota system in place for rice imports to the United States. We're just gonna take it that way. So the rice imported within the quota limit faces a lower tariff rate of 10% compared to the rice imported exceeding the quota limit, so 80% tariff rate. Um, and yeah, the quota limit is positioned above the graph, and it can be refers to the total amount of rice that can be imported at a lower tariff rate in quota. So that is something that I can explain here. Next slide, please. Um, okay, now we're going to talk about export tariffs and bans. Countries rarely use export tariffs or bans because they favor domestic needs over exports. So, example of export tariffs here are taxes on exports aiming to keep goods available domestically. For example, China's past grain tariff. Um, so yeah, if their local producers want to export things, it's a good thing for the government in a way, but then if it's like in a crisis or if there is a limited supply in the country, then the government may impose a tariff on exports to keep these grains in the country, to keep the supply in within, so they don't have to import, and might that because imports may lead to even more costs. And then there's also export bans. So they completely or partially stop exports. So, for example, oil ban in the US after the 1973 oil crisis. This usually happens, this might happen during wars and conflicts of a country, and usually will be used as one of the threats in a war treaty, for example. So a country that has a resource like oil or power basically, or maybe grains and vital resources, they may put this into as an advantage, because if you don't want to accept these terms on our war treaty, we may uh, add an export ban on these products and you will suffer in a way. So both of these tools can make domestic goods cheaper, but it hurts producers who miss out on selling abroad because of export uh, benefits. In recent years, these restrictions have been lifted to promote exports. For example, China's steel tariffs or benefit domestic producers. So there is a good and a bad way of seeing things from this case. Next slide, please. Now we are going to talk about local content requirements, which is something that we have touched upon in the opening case. Washington State keeping most of um, Boeing's factories in their state. This is because it is a requirement that some specific fraction of a good be produced domestically and can be expressed in either physical or value terms. So, for example, uh, maybe 80% of the production of a certain company needs to be made in a certain region, or they can be values. So maybe $1 million worth of products need to be produced in this region, and then you can produce the rest in other places. This shield domestic domestic part makers from foreign competition. So it can help to push a local economy by providing jobs and distributing salaries in a way. So it helps companies to keep the production local, but it hurts consumers because the standard prices, especially if we're talking about the US, it might be more expensive than if they were to source their products and production in China or India, for example. And this leads to higher cost for the consumers and they have to pay more. So the rule makes imports more expensive, which drives up the final price, as I've said before. So, in short, these regulations favor producers at the expense of consumers. So, there is a balance that some companies need to consider. Next slide is going to be explained by my friend.
Okay. So for administrative policies, uh, the definition is it's a bureaucratic rules designed to make it difficult for imports to enter a country. They are lengthy bureaucratic procedures that other countries must follow before shipping a product. And the purpose of this is the government encouraged to promote the home country domestically processed, processed goods rather than imports. There are arguments that Japan has mastered of these trade policies. For example, like in 2016, only 6% of 449 million cars sold in Japan were foreign and only 1% were US cars. Right, please? Next one is anti-dumping policies. So, dumping in this case is directly defined as selling goods in a foreign market at below their cost of production or as selling goods in a foreign market at below their market value. And anti-dumping policies are designed to punish foreign firms that engage in this activity. So why is it we need to protect why we need to use these anti-dumping policies? It's because uh, this activity is dangerous. Dumping enables consumer uh, in the importing country to obtain access to goods at an affordable price. However, it can also destroy the local market that will result in layoff and the closure of the business. So we can conclude that dumping is a form of unfair competition as products are being sold at a price that does not accurately reflect their cost. So in Indonesia, we have KADI. It's Komite Anti-Dumping Indonesia. It's under the Ministry of Trade, and their job is to do investigation about certain imported goods to prevent this type of trading and to protect domestic market as well. So you can see at the on their website, it's the recent case is about they're investigating some companies from China, Vietnam, and the point is to prevent this type of activity and to protect domestic market. Right, please. For there's some reason for government intervention. This is the political argument. The first one is protecting jobs and industry. So competition is most often viewed as unfair when producers in an exporting countries are subsidized in some way by the government. And then the second one is protecting national security. Countries sometimes argue that it's necessary to protect certain industry because they are important for national security. Usually, it's self-defense related industries like aerospace, advanced electronics, and semiconductors. The third one is retaliating. So some argue that government should use the threat to intervene in trade policy as a bargaining tool to help open foreign markets as and force trading partners to play by the rules of the game. So if it works, this kind of government intervention may liberalize trade and resulting in economic gains. But it's but however, it's a risky strategy because a country that is being pressured may not back down and instead may respond to the position of punitive tariffs by raising barriers of its own. If a government does not back down, the results could be higher trade barriers all around and economic loss to all involved. The fourth one is protecting consumers. Many governments have long had regulations to protect consumers from unsafe products. The indirect effect of such regulations often is to limit or ban the importation of such products. The fifth one is furthering foreign policy objectives. A government may grant preferential trade terms to a country with which it wants to build strong relations. Trade policy has also been used several times to pressure opponents rogue states that do not abide by international law or norms. And then the last one is protect human rights. Sometimes use trade policy to try to improve the human rights policy of trading partners. For example, like U.S. They kind of like limit their trade with the country of Myanmar because as a sanction because of the poor human rights practices over there. Right, please. For then there is government intervention in economic arguments. So the first one is the infant industry argument. This argument is proposed by Alexander Hamilton in 1972. The argument is many developing countries have potential competitive advantage in manufacturing, but new manufacturing industries cannot initially compete with established industry in developed countries. Uh, there are many economists remain critical of this argument for two reasons. The first one is protection uh, of manufacturing from foreign competition does no good unless the protection helps make the industry efficient. However, the protection seems to have done little more than foster the development of inefficient industries that have little hope of ever competing in the world market. For example, like Brazil. Brazil built the world's 10th largest auto industry behind tariff barriers and quotas. Once once those barriers were removed in the late 1980s, however, foreign imports soared and the industry was forced to face up the fact that after 30 years of protection, the Brazilian auto industry was one of the world's most inefficient. The second one, uh, it relies on assumption that firms are unable to make efficient long-term investment by borrowing money from the domestic or international capital market. Consequently, governments have been required to subsidize long-term investment. Given the development of global capital markets over the past 20 years, this assumption is no longer looks as valid as it once did. Next slide, please. For the second one, it's strategy trade policy. So in the previous chapter, in chapter 6, we have discussed about the new trade theory. It argues that in industries in which the existence of substantial economy of scale implies that the world market will profitably support only a few firms, country may predominate in the export of certain products simply because they have firms that were able to capture first mover advantage. So, what is the first mover advantage? Is it refers to an advantage gained by a company that first introduced a product or service to the market. So, it enables a company to establish a strong brand connection, and product service loyalty before other entrants to the market. So there are two arguments regarding this policy. The first one is by appropriate action, a government can help raise national income if it can somehow ensure that firms that gain first mover advantage in an industry are domestic rather than foreign enterprises. So, for example, like Japan's rise to dominate in the production of liquid crystal display screens, it's used in the computers. Although the screens were invented in the United States, the Japanese government, in cooperation with major electronic companies, targeted this industry for research support in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And the result was that Japanese firms, not US firms, subsequently capture first mover advantage in this market. And then the second one is it might pay a government to intervene in the industry by helping domestic firms overcome the barriers to entry created by foreign firms that have already raised first mover advantage. So for the next slide will be presented by Ivan.
Next is the revised case for the revised case for free trade. So the strategic trade policy arguments of the new trade theory suggest an economic justification for government intervention in international trade. This justification challenges the rationale of unrestricted free trade found in the work of classic trade theorists such as Adam Smith and David Ricardo. In response to this challenge to economic orthodoxy, a number of economists, including some of those responsible for the development of the new trade theory, such as Paul Krugman, point out that although strategic trade policy looks appealing in theory, in practice it may be unworkable. This response to the strategic trade policy argument constitutes the revised case for free trade. This is the retaliation and trade war. So Krugman argues that strategic trade policies aimed at boosting domestic firms at the expense of others can lead to trade wars and all in subsidized competitors like Boeing facing Airbus. He suggests establishing rules to minimize trade distorting subsidies as pursued by the World Trade Organization. Additionally, anti-dumping policies can target subsidized competitors selling goods below production costs. The approach seeks to mitigate the risk of retaliatory actions and trade conflicts while promoting fair competition in global trade. This is the domestic policies. So Krugman argues that government's interventions in the economy are often influenced by politically powerful interest groups, as seen in the European Union's common agricultural policy favoring farmers over consumers. This dynamic undermines the effectiveness of strategic trade policies, which are likely to be captured by special interest groups, distorting outcomes. So therefore, Krugman suggests that while free trade with minimal exceptions may not be theoretically optimal, it's often the best achievable policy given the influence of special interests on government decision-making process. Next is the development of the World Trade System. The essence of the problem in achieving unrestricted free trade between neighboring countries like Brazil and Argentina lies in a lack of trust. Both governments recognize the benefits of lower trade barriers but fear being taken advantage of it if they act unilaterally. This deadlock can be resolved through negotiations and the establishment of rules governing trade. monitored and enforced by an independent body like the World Trade Organization (WTO). So despite concerns about compromising national sovereignty, the evolution from the GATT or General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade to the WTO demonstrates the effectiveness of this international trading framework in promoting fair and open trade. Next is the From Smith of the Great Depression. The theoretical basis for free trade was established by Adam Smith and David Ricardo in the late 18th century. Great Britain embraced free trade as government policy in 1846 with the repeal of the Corn Laws, despite initial resistance. Over the next 80 years, Britain advocated for trade liberalization, but its major trading partners did not reciprocate. Britain maintained unilateral free trade due to its status as a dominant trading power. However, the economic turmoil of the Great Depression led to a reversal of free trade policies globally, exemplified by the passage of the Smoot-Hawley tariff in the US in 1930, which triggered retaliatory tariff increases worldwide and worsened the economic downturn. Next is the 1947-1979 GATT trade liberalization and economic growth. The economic damage caused by the Smoot-Hawley expert the United States to shift towards free trade policies after World War II. Under U.S. leadership, the GATT was established in 1947, aiming to eliminate tariffs, subsidies, and import quotas. GATT's membership expanded from 19 to over 120 nations, and through 8 rounds of negotiations, it successfully reduced tariffs. The average tariff in the US declined by nearly 92% between 1947 and 1979, stimulating economic growth in line with the theoretical arguments of economists like David Ricardo. Next is the protection of intellectual property. So during the 1980s and the early 1990s, the GATT trading system faced increasing strain due to rising pressures for protectionism worldwide. Japan's economic success, particularly in industry like automobiles and semiconductors, created tensions as it becomes the world's second largest economy and largest exporter. Additionally, the present trade deficit of the United States led to demands for protection against imports, causing adjustments and unemployment in various industries. Moreover, countries found ways to circumvent GATT regulations such as through bilateral voluntary exports restraints or the VERS, which were not addressed by GATT. Bureaucracy, bureaucracy this verse, like the automobile agreement between Japan and the US, contributed to growing trade tensions, with 16% of imports subjected to non-tariff barriers by 1986. This is the Uruguay round and the World Trade Organization. So the Uruguay round dragged on for 7 years before an agreement was reached on December 15, 1993. It went into effect July 1, 1995. The Uruguay round contained the following provisions. There are 7. The first one is tariffs. Tariffs on industrial goods were to be reduced by more than one-third, and the tariffs were to be scrapped on more than 40% of manufactured goods. Second one is average tariffs rates imposed by developed nations on manufactured goods were to be reduced to less than 4% of value, the lowest level in modern history. Third one is agricultural subsidies were to be substantially reduced. Fourth one is GATT, fair trade and market access rules were to be extended to cover a wide range of services. Fifth one is GATT rules also were to be extended to provide enhanced protection for patents, copyrights, and trademarks, intellectual property. Next one is barriers on trade in textiles were to be significantly reduced over 10 years. And the last one is the World Trade Organization was to be created to implement the GATT agreement. This is the next one is the World Trade Organization. It encompasses the GATT along with two new sister bodies, one on services, GATS, and the other one on intellectual property, TRIPS for short. The GATS extends free trade agreements to services, while TRIPS aims to standardize intellectual property rights protection internationally. The WTO is responsible for arbitrating trade disputes and monitoring member countries' trade policies. Unlike the GATT, the WTO operates on consensus, but in dispute settlement, arbitration panel reports are automatically adopted unless there is a consensus to reject them. The WTO appellate body's verdict is binding, and non-compliance with arbitration panel recommendations can lead to compensation or trade sanctions. The WTO has strict time limits for each stage of dispute resolution process, giving it enforcement capabilities lacking in the GATT. Next is the World Trade Organization experience to date. So here are the points that I got. The first one is as of 2016, the WTO had 864 members, accounting for 98% of global trade. Second one is despite initial expectations for enhanced effectiveness compared to the GATT, progress in further trade liberalization has been slow since the late 1990s. Third one is recent trade talks, notably the Doha round, have seen limited success. Fourth one is the global financial crisis of 2008 2000 until 2009 led to a resurgence of limited protectionism. And the last one is events such as Brexit and the election of Donald Trump have raised uncertainties about the future directions of the World Trade Organization. So the WTO as follows. In its first 2 decades, the WTO's policy and enforcement mechanism have shown positive effects. Between 1995 and 2015, over 500 trade disputes among member countries were brought to the WTO, compared to only 896 cases handled by the GATT over almost 50 years. Three Three-fourths of these disputes were resolved through informal consultations, with the remaining cases mostly resolved successfully through formal procedures. So overall, countries have generally adopted the WTO's recommendations, indicating confidence in its dispute or resolution procedures. Next is the expanded trade agreements. So here are the points that I got. The Uruguay round extended global trading rules to services with the WTO tasked to broker further liberalization agreements. Focus was on extending regulations to govern foreign direct investment targeting industries like telecommunication and financial services. In February 1997, a WTO brokered deal opened telecommunications market to competition, enabling foreign investment and establishing fair competition rules. A December 1997 agreement liberalized border trade in financial services, covering over 95% of the global market. 102 countries pledged to open banking, securities, and insurance sectors to foreign competition, with 70 countries lowering barriers to foreign direct investment. The last one is major markets like the US and the Europe fully open to inward investment, while many Asian countries allowed significant foreign participation in their financial sectors. Next slide will be presented by my friend Ella.
Okay, so after hearing a fun explanation about the WTO or World Trade Organization, now I'm going to discuss regarding the future of the WTO. So, since the success of the 1990s, the World Trade Organization has struggled to make progress on the international trade front. Many of the WTO officers issue that the world's economic situation, such as high unemployment, environmental degradation, poor working conditions in developing nations, falling real wage rates among the lower paid in developed nations, and rising income inequality is because of the policy that WTO made. Because of this argument, WTO then create four main issue uh, agendas such as anti-dumping policies, the high level of protectionism in agriculture, the lack of strong protection for intellectual property rights in many nations, and continued high tariff rates on non-agricultural goods and services in many nations, which we will later discuss in the next slide. But other than the four main issue, it is also believed that the argument that opposers made is because many countries didn't do the regulation that WTO made. They seem to follow it on the surface, but in reality, they uh, didn't follow it at all. For example, here I've taken from the book is China, which has been failing to play by the international trading rules. Next slide, please. So before I say that there is four main issues that WTO are currently attempting, and the first one there is anti-dumping action, which actually already discussed, already explained by Valis, but I'm going to explain here in a more simplified, just in case. So, anti-dumping action happen when a country export its goods or producers in a country sell goods at a lower price in international market than its domestic market. Here, WTO rules allow countries to impose anti-dumping duties on foreign goods that are being sold cheaper than at home or below their cost of production when domestic producers can show that they are being harmed. Uh, to came up with the solution, WTO suggesting that it will reflect persistent protectionist tendencies and pushing members to strengthen the regulations governing the imposition of anti-dumping duties. The second issue that are being faced by WTO is protectionism in agriculture. So another focus of the WTO has been the high level of tariff and subsidies in the agricultural sector of many economies. Tariff rates on agricultural products are generally much higher than tariff rates on manufactured products or services. For example, here the average tariff of non-agricultural products are usually around 4%. But on the other hand, Canada have 21.2%, Europe has 15.9%, Japan has 18.6%, which are above the average tariff rates. Here, WTO argued that removing tariff barriers and subsidies could significantly boost the overall level of trade, lower price to consumers, and raise global economic growth by freeing consumption and investment resources for more productive use. In other words, free trade in agriculture could help jumpstart economic growth among the world's poorer nations and alleviate global poverty. Next slide, please. Next, the third issue here we have protection of intellectual properties. This topic already discussed by Ivan, but I'm going to explain it again. So the TRIPS or TRIPS regulation oblige WTO members to grant and enforce patent lasting at least 20 years and copyright lasting 50 years. Rich countries had to comply with the rules within a year, while poor countries, on the other hand, had to comply within 5 years, and the more poorest nation had to comply within 10 years. The basis for this agreement was a strong belief among signatory nations that the protection of intellectual property through patent, trademarks, and copyright must be an essential element of the international trading system. Because innovation is a central engine of economic growth and rising living standards. The argument has been that a multilateral agreement is needed to protect intellectual property, which multilateral agreement we will discuss it in the last part. But for example, here India, I've taken example of India and US case. India might market imitation of patent innovation pioneered in a different country, say for example United States. This can affect two things. The first one, it will reduce the export opportunities in India for the original innovator in the United States. And the second one, the extent that the Indian producer is able to export its pirated imitation to additional countries, is also reduce the export opportunities in those countries for the US inventor. Next slide, please. For the last issue, we have market access for non-agricultural goods and services. Although the WTO and the GATT have made big strides in reducing the tariff rates on non-agricultural products, but still there is a lot of work that remains. In addition, tariff on services remain higher than on industrial goods. For example, here is Europe has 8.5%, Japan has 19.7%, and given the rising value of cross-border trade in services, reducing these figures can be expected to yield substantial gains. The WTO would like to bring down tariff rates still further and reduce the scope for the selective use of high tariff rates. The ultimate aim is to reduce tariff rates to zero. Many of these nations use the infant industry argument to justify the continued imposition of high tariff rates. However, ultimately, these rates needs to come down for these nations to reap the full benefit of international trade. Next slide, please. For the last is so next topics we have multilateral and bilateral trade agreements. So in response to the apparent failure that we discussed before, we can conclude that many nations have pushed forward with multilateral or bilateral trade agreements, which are reciprocal trade agreements between two or more partners. Multilateral and bilateral trade agreements are designed to capture gain from trade beyond those agreements currently attainable under WTO treaties. Multilateral and bilateral trade agreements are allowed under WTO rules, and countries entering into this agreement are required to notify the WTO. For example, here I've put in 2014, Australia and Chinese entered into a bilateral free trade agreements, and also in March uh, 2012, the United States entered into bilateral free trade agreements with South Korea. But unfortunately for United States, this agreement has been broken down by Trump that we actually already discussed in the last chapter. Next slide, please. So that's it for our presentation regarding chapter 7. Uh, Thank you.